What if the people meant to love you were the ones who betrayed you first? Eleanor Lancaster never believed in fairy tales, especially not the kind where the girl falls for the ruthless billionaire husband she never wanted. But when her own mother sells her off like a business deal, Eleanor is left with two choices: fight for her freedom or learn to play the game better than anyone. Enter Damien Lancaster, powerful, untouchable, a man with secrets as dangerous as the world he controls. He never wanted a wife, but now he has one. And Eleanor? She refuses to be another pawn in his empire. But in a war of lies, power, and control, the most dangerous thing of all is falling for the enemy. One marriage, two rivals, and a game neither of them can afford to lose. Because in the end, someone always gets burned. Eleanor Whitmore had always known that her mother, Vivian, was ruthless. She had spent her entire life watching the woman manipulate, lie, and charm her way through high society, ensuring that she and her golden child, Eleanor's elder sister Cassandra, remained the center of admiration and privilege. But never, not in her worst nightmares, did Eleanor expect to be the next pawn in her mother's endless game of wealth and power. The night of the betrayal was supposed to be a simple family gathering, an extravagant dinner at their sprawling estate, where Eleanor, dressed in a soft blue satin gown, sat quietly at the long dining table, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. Cassandra, draped in a diamond-encrusted gown that was a little too much for a dinner, sat across from her, smirking every time their mother shot a disapproving glance in Eleanor's direction. It was nothing new. She was the overlooked daughter, the disposable one, the girl who had always been treated as an afterthought. But when their butler entered the dining hall with a neatly prepared envelope and placed it before Eleanor, a chill ran down her spine. "Sign it," her mother instructed, her voice smooth as silk yet carrying the undeniable weight of command. Eleanor's hazel eyes flickered toward the envelope, her fingers trembling as she picked it up, her heart hammering in her chest. A marriage contract. A legally binding agreement that stated she was to marry Damien Lancaster, the cold-hearted billionaire known for his ruthless business empire and his reputation of being unapproachable, untouchable, and completely heartless. Her breath caught as she read the terms. She wasn't just marrying him. She was being sold to him like an object, a bargaining chip to save her father's failing investments. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but before she could push the papers away, Cassandra laughed, twirling a glass of red wine between her fingers. "Oh, come on, Eleanor. It's not like anyone else would want you. At least Damien has money." Her mother sighed dramatically, as if her daughter's defiance was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Eleanor, don't be ungrateful. This is the best thing that could happen to you. You'll have wealth, security, a husband who doesn't even know me," Eleanor snapped, her voice rising with panic. "This is insane, even for you." But Vivian merely arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "Damien has agreed, and you will too." Before Eleanor could shove the papers back in refusal, her mother pulled out her final weapon. "If you don't," she said smoothly, "your father will lose everything. Our house, our name, the little dignity you have left. And let's not forget, dear, that I hold all your medical records, financial records. I could make sure you have nowhere to go, no way to survive on your own. Think carefully before you embarrass me further." Eleanor's heart shattered. It wasn't a request. It was an order. And the worst part? There was no escape. Tears burned her eyes as she reached for the pen, her hand trembling, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her like an avalanche. Cassandra let out a soft chuckle, clearly enjoying every second of Eleanor's misery. And as she signed her name on the contract, sealing her fate, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just an arranged marriage. This was a war. And one day she would make them all regret this. Eleanor didn't remember much about the day she was handed over like a neatly wrapped parcel, except for the suffocating weight of betrayal and the numbness that settled deep into her bones. Her mother, dressed in an elegant designer dress, as if she were attending a gala rather than forcing her daughter into a loveless marriage, had barely spared her a glance as they drove to the Lancaster estate. Cassandra had been even worse, sipping champagne in the back seat, smirking whenever Eleanor's fingers trembled in her lap. "Try not to embarrass yourself," Cassandra mused, tilting her head in mock sympathy. "You're already an inconvenience. No need to be a messy one, too." The words stung, but Eleanor refused to let her see it. She had spent a lifetime being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like nothing. But today? Today, she was stepping into a new kind of hell, one that would require her to be stronger than ever. As their limousine pulled through the grand wrought iron gates of the Lancaster estate, Eleanor's breath hitched. The mansion before her was nothing short of a fortress, tall, imposing, and surrounded by security so tight she doubted she could even think about escaping without someone knowing. And waiting at the top of the grand marble staircase was Damien Lancaster himself, the man she was being forced to marry. He was every bit as intimidating as the newspapers described him. Broad-shouldered, impossibly tall, and exuding an aura so cold it made the winter breeze seem warm in comparison. His jet-black hair was neatly styled, his sharp chiseled features set in stone, and his icy gray eyes barely flicked over her as she stepped out of the car. He was dressed in an immaculate three-piece black suit, looking less like a groom and more like a king prepared to accept a sacrifice. "So, this is her?" he asked, voice devoid of warmth as he glanced at Vivian with a look of pure indifference. "I expected more." Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she refused to react, even as Cassandra stifled a laugh. Vivian, ever the performer, merely smiled, as if her daughter's humiliation was an insignificant detail. "She will be a loyal wife," she said, her voice silky smooth. "And she understands that she is to do as she is told." Eleanor clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath her skin, but she knew that any outburst now would only amuse them. Damien studied her for a long moment, his unreadable gaze finally settling on her, as if she were a piece of art he was debating purchasing. "We'll see about that," he murmured, before turning on his heel and walking into the mansion. No greeting, no pleasantries, just dismissal. And just like that, she realized what her life with him was going to be. The ceremony itself was nothing more than a formality, a legal exchange sealed with signatures rather than vows of love. There was no extravagant wedding, no flowers, no grand romance. Just a sterile room inside the Lancaster estate where a lawyer read through their contract while Damien signed without hesitation. When it was Eleanor's turn, her hands trembled as she picked up the pen, the weight of her fate pressing against her. But as she signed her name for the second time in 2 days, she made herself a silent promise. "This may be my cage, but I will not be their prisoner forever." "Congratulations," the lawyer said dryly, tucking the contract away. "You're now legally husband and wife." Damien barely looked at her. He merely stood buttoning his suit jacket and said, "You'll be escorted to your new room. My schedule is packed and I don't have time for small talk." Eleanor's chest tightened, but she nodded stiffly, refusing to let him see how much his indifference stung. As he walked away, his phone already in hand as he resumed business as if she didn't exist, she finally let herself exhale. So, this was it. This was her husband. A man who saw her as nothing more than an obligation, just as her mother had intended. But even though she had no power here, even though she was alone in a world that would chew her up and spit her out if she wasn't careful, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let them break her. Because if this was war, then she would fight. Not for their approval, not for their affection, but for herself. Life inside the Lancaster estate was colder than she had anticipated. The staff treated her with a distant politeness, following orders but never engaging beyond what was necessary. The house itself was beautiful. Grand chandeliers, expensive artwork, luxurious furniture, but it lacked something vital. Warmth. Damien, for his part, was a ghost. He was out of the house before she even woke up, and when he returned, it was long after midnight. It was almost as if she didn't exist to him. Days passed, then weeks, and not once did he acknowledge her presence beyond necessity. No dinner together, no idle conversations, no attempts at being anything more than two strangers sharing a legal bond. And yet, it wasn't hatred she sensed from him. It wasn't anger. It was nothingness. And that was worse. Eleanor wasn't sure how long she could endure being invisible in her own marriage, but one night changed everything. She had been wandering the estate, trying to explore what was now her new home, when she overheard voices coming from Damien's office. Curious, she edged closer, pressing herself against the wall as she listened. "She's not like the others," a man's voice, one she recognized as Lucas, Damien's right-hand man, said. "She isn't after your money." There was silence, then a sharp exhale. "It doesn't matter," Damien's voice finally came, cold as ever. "She's just another part of the deal." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Just another part of the deal. She shouldn't have been surprised. She should have expected it. But hearing it from his own mouth made something inside her snap. If he thought she was just another piece in his business transactions, then fine. She wouldn't waste a second trying to prove otherwise. She had spent her entire life being ignored, being cast aside. But not anymore. Because one day Damien Lancaster would regret ever underestimating her. Eleanor had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the sharpest weapon a woman could wield, and so she embraced it. If Damien Lancaster wanted to pretend she didn't exist, she would return the favor. She wouldn't seek him out, wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't beg for his attention like some desperate, love-starved wife. Instead, she made it her mission to learn everything she could about the world she had been thrown into. The Lancaster estate was massive, but it ran like a well-oiled machine. The staff were efficient, discreet, and eerily silent in their presence. It didn't take long for Eleanor to realize that even though she was Mrs. Lancaster on paper, she was merely a tolerated occupant in this grand house. She had no power, no place, no voice, just an existence her husband refused to acknowledge. But she had never been the kind of woman to accept being invisible, and she sure as hell wasn't about to start now. In the mornings, she found ways to occupy herself, familiarizing herself with the estate, speaking with the staff even when they hesitated to engage with her. She wasn't cruel like Damien. She didn't bark orders or look through them as if they were furniture. She learned their names, their roles, and though they were wary at first, a few started offering polite smiles in return. Mrs. Hawthorne, the older housekeeper with graying brown hair and sharp eyes, was the first to soften toward her. "You're not what I expected," she admitted one afternoon, watching as Eleanor absent-mindedly ran her fingers along the grand piano in the parlor. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her hazel eyes narrowing. "What did you expect?" Mrs. Hawthorne pursed her lips, hesitating before saying, "A woman more like your mother." Eleanor felt an unexpected stab in her chest at those words. She wasn't sure whether to be offended or relieved, but she only nodded. "I'm nothing like my mother." If only she had the courage to say that to Vivian's face. But if life inside the Lancaster estate was an intricate, silent game of chess, then Damien Lancaster was a player unlike any she had ever encountered. Every evening, Eleanor heard the deep growl of his sleek black car pulling into the driveway, but by the time she made her way downstairs, he had already disappeared into his office. It was as if he mastered the art of existing in his own home without ever actually being seen. He never asked if she was adjusting, never gave her a reason for his absence. He worked late into the night, speaking in low, clipped tones over the phone, his deep voice carrying through the halls. Every now and then, she'd catch glimpses of him, his suit jacket tossed carelessly over the back of his leather chair, his tie loosened, his hair slightly tousled from exhaustion. But it was never enough. He was a shadow, an enigma, a ghost of a husband. Until the night she stopped pretending he didn't infuriate her. It had been a particularly long evening. Eleanor had spent most of the day on the phone with her father, if the man who had sold her to a billionaire still deserved such a title. His company, the one her mother had saved by orchestrating this marriage, was still struggling. And now, Vivian had the audacity to demand that Eleanor convince Damien to pour more money into their sinking ship. "You're his wife," her mother had scoffed, as if that meant anything. "Use what you have to keep us afloat." The words had made Eleanor sick. Use what she had? She wanted to laugh at the sheer audacity of it. If only her mother knew that Damien Lancaster barely acknowledged her existence, let alone valued her enough to listen to her requests. So that evening, fueled by frustration, she did something reckless. She went to his office. For weeks she had avoided invading his space, but not tonight. The grand wooden doors to his office were slightly ajar, and without knocking, she pushed them open and stepped inside. Damien was at his desk, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, looking every bit like the powerful businessman the world feared. His dark hair was slightly mussed, as if he had been running his fingers through it in frustration, and his steel-gray eyes flickered up in irritation the second she entered. "You're not supposed to be in here." His tone was cool, dismissive. Eleanor, however, refused to be intimidated. She took a step closer, arms crossed over her chest. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to speak to my own husband." His lips curled at the word husband, as if the mere reminder of their marriage was an inconvenience. "That implies this is a real marriage." Eleanor should have expected the cutting remark, but it still stung. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see it. "Then let's talk about what it really is," she shot back. "A contract, one where you owe my family more than you've already given." Damien leaned back in his chair, watching her with something close to amusement. "Is that what they told you to say?" His voice was low, dangerous. "That I still owe them? That the price of your freedom wasn't already paid in full?" Eleanor's nails dug into her palm. "I didn't choose this arrangement. You and my mother did. I had no say." His expression darkened, his gaze turning ice cold. "And yet here you are, in my house, wearing my name." Something in her snapped, not by choice. The words hung between them, sharp and brutal. Damien exhaled, rubbing his temples, as if she were nothing more than a nuisance to be tolerated. "Then stop pretending you have any power here, Eleanor," he murmured, standing up. He was tall, towering over her, consuming the space. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and yet she refused to back down. "You are here because it was necessary, nothing more." For a moment she almost believed him. Almost. But there was something in the way his eyes lingered on her just a second too long, something in the slight clench of his jaw that told her he wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. And for the first time since stepping into this house, Eleanor felt something unexpected. Power. If Damien Lancaster thought she was just another pawn in his world, then he had no idea what he had just unleashed. Because Eleanor wasn't just going to survive this marriage, she was going to win. Eleanor had never been good at being quiet, and now that she had decided to fight back, she wasn't about to let Damien Lancaster continue pretending she didn't exist. If he wanted a wife who would stay in the background, silently accepting her fate, he had married the wrong woman. So she did the one thing she knew would get under his skin. She made herself impossible to ignore. She started attending his business dinners, charming clients with her sharp wit and effortless grace, making sure they knew she was more than just the woman attached to Damien's name. She inserted herself into conversations at the estate, asking the staff about the business, about the investments, and when she caught Damien watching her from across the room, his gray eyes unreadable, she smiled sweetly, daring him to react. But the real war began, the night she crashed one of his exclusive business meetings. It was a high-profile dinner at one of the city's most luxurious hotels, and Eleanor had been specifically uninvited, which, of course, only made her more determined to attend. Dressed in a sleek black gown that hugged her curves and exuded power, she walked into the private dining hall like she belonged there. The room fell into a stunned silence when she entered. Damien, seated at the head of the long table, slowly set his glass of whiskey down, his expression unreadable. His business associates, men who thrived on intimidation, glanced between them, sensing the shift in the air. "Apologies for being late," Eleanor said smoothly, sliding into the empty seat next to Damien. "I didn't want to miss the opportunity to hear my husband discuss the empire I've been forced into." Damien's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the edge of the table. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor merely lifted a delicate brow. "And yet, here I am." The other men exchanged glances, intrigued. Lucas Sterling, Damien's right-hand man, smirked into his drink, clearly amused by the audacity of it all. "Well, this just got interesting," he murmured. Damien didn't respond, but Eleanor could feel the heat of his gaze on her the entire evening. She spoke when she pleased, charmed the men he did business with, and when one of the investors leaned a little too close offering his card, Eleanor saw Damien's fingers twitch against his glass. "I appreciate the offer," Eleanor said, taking the card between two fingers before slowly sliding it back across the table. "But I'm married to a Lancaster. I don't need another powerful man." The tension snapped like a live wire, and Damien's gray eyes darkened, his expression finally shifting from boredom to something else entirely, something dangerous. The moment dinner was over, he grabbed her wrist, pulling her aside into a quiet hallway. "What the hell was that?" he growled, his grip firm but not painful. Eleanor met his glare head-on. "That was me making sure no one forgets who I am." His jaw clenched. "I didn't forget." The words hung between them, charged with something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. His grip loosened, his fingers lingering against her skin for just a second too long before he stepped back. But it was already too late. The air between them had shifted, and for the first time since their marriage began, Damien Lancaster was finally paying attention. But Eleanor knew the game wasn't over yet. Because she hadn't just walked into his world, she had set it on fire. Eleanor knew she had cracked something in Damien that night at the business dinner, but she wasn't foolish enough to think he'd suddenly become a loving husband overnight. No, Damien Lancaster was still an iceberg, cold, unyielding, and impossible to read. But now at least he was watching her, acknowledging her presence in a way that was both infuriating and electrifying. She caught his gaze lingering on her in the mornings when she moved around the house in silk robes, sipping her coffee as if she wasn't in a battle of silent warfare with him. He started coming home earlier, not to see her, of course, but the timing was too much of a coincidence to ignore. He began engaging in their exchanges, his clipped responses no longer dismissive but sharp, intrigued, like he was finally seeing her as something more than an obligation. But Eleanor wasn't just going to wait around for him to figure out what he wanted. She had her own battles to fight. Her mother had started calling her incessantly, each conversation more manipulative than the last. "You're in a position of power now, Eleanor," Vivian had cooed one afternoon, the saccharine sweetness in her voice enough to make Eleanor's stomach turn. "It's time you acted like it. The Lancaster name can do so much for your father's company, for your sister's future. Don't you want to be useful?" Eleanor had clenched her jaw, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Useful. That was all she had ever been to them, a bargaining chip, a means to an end. And yet, despite everything, they still thought they had control over her. But they didn't know she wasn't the same Eleanor they had sold off weeks ago. She had changed. She wasn't desperate for their approval anymore. So, the next time her mother called, Eleanor sent the call to voicemail. And when Cassandra had the audacity to text her, "At least do one thing right in your life and convince your husband to help us," she blocked her number without hesitation. She was done playing the obedient daughter, the invisible sister. She had her own future to protect now. And somehow that future had begun to include Damien. Their interactions had shifted into something neither of them could name, something unspoken but undeniably there. One evening, Eleanor had been reading in the library, curled up in a leather armchair with a book in her lap, when Damien walked in, clearly expecting the room to be empty. He paused in the doorway, eyes flicking over her in a way that sent a ripple of awareness through her. He was in his usual black suit, but the tie was loosened, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he had run his fingers through it too many times that day. "You read," he mused, his voice lacking the usual cold detachment. Eleanor raised a brow, tilting the book so he could see the title. "I do more than just exist in your house, you know." He hummed, stepping further inside, his hands in his pockets as he glanced at the bookshelves. "I never said you didn't." It wasn't an admission of interest, but it wasn't dismissive either. Progress. The tension between them had been building for weeks, a slow, simmering thing that neither of them wanted to address, but neither of them could ignore. It was in the way his fingers brushed against hers when he handed her a glass of wine at dinner, the way she caught him watching her from across the room, his gaze less cold, more searching. And then came the night that changed everything. Eleanor had been in the garden, unable to sleep, enjoying the crisp night air, when Damien appeared behind her, his voice low and unreadable. "You've made yourself comfortable here," he observed, standing close. Too close. Eleanor turned to face him, her heart pounding. "I figured if I'm trapped here, I might as well make the best of it." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but it was softer than anything she had seen from him before. "I underestimated you," he admitted, his gray eyes locked onto hers, something dangerous and magnetic in them. Eleanor swallowed hard, knowing that whatever had been building between them was about to break. And when he lifted his hand, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear, she knew she was already too far gone. Because Damien Lancaster wasn't just the man she had been forced to marry anymore. He was becoming something far more dangerous to her heart. Eleanor had always known she was playing with fire, but she hadn't realized just how much she wanted to burn. Whatever this was between her and Damien, it was no longer just a battle of indifference or stubborn defiance. It was something darker, deeper, hungrier. He wasn't just ignoring her anymore. He wasn't dismissing her as an inconvenience. He was watching her. Every time she entered a room, his gray eyes would linger a second too long, his expression unreadable, as if he was trying to figure her out. And it wasn't just his eyes. It was in the small things, the way he would stand too close, his fingers brushing against hers when he reached for a glass, the way his gaze dropped to her lips when she spoke. But just when she thought she might be getting somewhere with him, that maybe, just maybe, Damien Lancaster wasn't as cold as he wanted the world to believe, he pulled away. Hard. One evening after dinner, she had found herself alone with him in his office, the warm glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across his chiseled features. He had been watching her again, his hands resting on the edge of his desk, his sleeves rolled up, his usual impenetrable mask slightly cracked. "You've changed things," he had murmured, almost to himself, but Eleanor had heard it. She had felt it. And just as she had taken a step closer, just as she had dared to think he might meet her halfway, his expression had gone cold. "But that doesn't mean I'll ever want this." The words had felt like a slap, sharp and deliberate, and Eleanor had refused to let him see how much they hurt. Instead, she had smiled, tilting her head. "Who said I wanted this either?" she had thrown back, before walking out of his office with her head high and her heart aching. But if Damien thought that one cold rejection would push her back into silence, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Eleanor wasn't going to let him decide how this marriage played out. Not anymore. So if he wanted distance, she would give him chaos. She started showing up at events she knew he would be at, dressed in daring gowns that left men staring, their gazes trailing after her like moths to a flame. She laughed a little too sweetly at the charming words of his competitors, smiled a little too brightly when she knew Damien was watching, And oh, he was watching. His jaw would tighten, his fingers would curl around his glass, and when she dared to let another man brush a hand against hers, he would excuse himself from conversations without a word. It was a dangerous game, and she was winning. Until one night she pushed him too far. At a charity gala, she had been laughing at some harmless joke from Lucas Sterling, Damien's right-hand man, when a hand wrapped around her wrist, firm and possessive. Before she could react, she was being pulled out of the ballroom, down a quiet hallway, until she was pressed against the cool marble wall. Damien. His suit was perfectly tailored, but his tie was slightly loosened, his gray eyes dark with something she couldn't quite name. "You like playing games, don't you?" he murmured, his voice dangerously low, his hand still resting against her wrist, his thumb brushing against the soft skin there. Eleanor refused to back down. "Isn't that what we've been doing since day one?" His eyes flickered with something unreadable before his grip tightened just for a second. "You're my wife," he reminded her, as if she needed to hear it, as if she could forget. And Eleanor, with her heart pounding in her chest and her pulse thrumming under his touch, made a fatal mistake. She whispered, "Then act like it." For a moment, the air between them was charged, thick with something neither of them were willing to name. But just as fast as it had come, Damien let go, stepping back, his mask slipping back into place. "Be careful what you wish for, Eleanor," he said smoothly, before walking away, leaving her standing there, breathless and completely, hopelessly undone. And that's when she realized this wasn't just a marriage anymore. This was a war neither of them could afford to lose. Eleanor should have known that pushing Damien Lancaster would come at a cost, but she hadn't expected him to start pushing back. If she thought she could manipulate his attention, that she could force him to acknowledge what was happening between them, she was mistaken. He didn't just meet her games, he mastered them. The very next morning, as she walked into the grand dining hall, expecting the usual cold silence, she found another woman sitting at the table. Stunning, elegant, with sleek black hair and a smile just a little too knowing. "Eleanor," Damien greeted smoothly, his gray eyes calm, unreadable, but tinged with something dangerously close to amusement. "Meet Lydia. We have some business to discuss." Business. Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she refused to show it. If he thought this was how he would remind her of her place, he had no idea how far she was willing to go. So, instead of backing down, she walked up to him, placing a hand on his shoulder, intimate, possessive, just enough to make the woman across from him hesitate. "Of course," Eleanor purred, leaning in just enough to feel Damien's muscles tense beneath her touch. "Do continue." His jaw clenched, but he didn't move, didn't pull away, and that alone was a victory. But this was just the beginning. They were locked in a battle neither of them would surrender. The days that followed turned into a carefully crafted storm of tension. Damien stopped avoiding her. He made a point to be around her, watching, waiting, daring her to break. When they attended an event together, he would rest a hand at the small of her back, his touch light but firm, sending shivers down her spine as he whispered in her ear, "You wanted me to act like a husband, didn't you?" And then he'd disappear into business meetings, leaving her wanting, waiting, drowning in the war he had started. The tension between them was unbearable, a dance of unspoken words, of stolen glances, of moments that teetered on the edge of something dangerous. And then, it all came crashing down. One evening, Eleanor had been reading in the library when Damien entered without a word, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something raw, something unsettled. He stalked toward her, his gray eyes dark, his hands tightening into fists before he finally spoke. "Why do you do it?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was something under it, something that told her she had finally reached the heart of whatever this was between them. Eleanor closed her book, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Do what?" His jaw ticked. "Push me." She let out a breathless laugh. "Because you pretend not to care. But we both know you do. the air between them snapped like a live wire. And then, before she could say another word, he was on her. It wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle, it was fire. His lips crashed against hers, his hands framing her face, pulling her closer as if he had finally lost the battle he had been fighting for so long. And Eleanor? She let herself fall, let herself sink into the heat, into the chaos, into the reality that Damien Lancaster, the man who once dismissed her, the man who swore this marriage was nothing, was kissing her like he would never get the chance again. When he pulled away, his breathing uneven, his forehead resting against hers, she knew. This wasn't just a marriage anymore. This was a war they had both already lost. Eleanor had always known that being Damien Lancaster's wife was a game of power, but she hadn't expected to almost die playing it. The fire between them had only grown since that night in the library, since he had kissed her like she was the only thing keeping him alive. But Damien, true to form, had shut down afterward, retreating into his walls like nothing had happened. He avoided her more than ever, refused to acknowledge what they had both felt in that moment. And Eleanor, angry, frustrated, done, decided she had enough. So she did the one thing that always got under his skin. She made herself visible. She attended business events with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, let Lucas Sterling flirt with her just enough to make Damien's jaw tighten from across the room, and spent her time not waiting for him to decide what he wanted. And then it happened. The near-death moment that shattered everything. It had been one of Damien's high-profile charity events, hosted at a luxurious rooftop venue, the kind where the air smelled like money, and everyone pretended to like each other while secretly plotting their downfall. Eleanor had barely seen Damien all night. He had been locked in business conversations, his expression carefully indifferent whenever their gazes met. She had danced with men who weren't her husband, laughed at their jokes, pushed every damn button she could, but nothing prepared her for what happened next. The railing on the rooftop terrace had been unstable. No one had noticed. No one except the man Eleanor had been speaking to, a well-known investor who had gotten a little too handsy, a little too close. When Eleanor took a step back to put space between them, her heel hit the loose paneling. And then she was falling. The world tilted. The air rushed out of her lungs. A scream caught in her throat, panic clawing at her chest as the city lights blurred beneath her. She barely registered the strong hands that yanked her back at the last second, the force so sudden, so desperate, that she was slammed against a solid, heaving chest. Damien. He had caught her. His grip was iron tight, his arms caging her against him, as if letting go wasn't an option. His breathing was ragged, harsh, and when she finally managed to look up, she saw it. Not indifference, not ice, not control. She saw fear, real, raw, unmasked fear in his stormy gray eyes. For her. Eleanor swallowed hard, her own breath shaky. "Damien, don't," he snapped, but his voice lacked its usual cutting edge. His arms didn't loosen, his grip didn't falter, and his forehead dropped against hers, just for a second, like he needed the touch to ground himself, like he needed to make sure she was really there. The entire world had gone still around them. The party, the guests, the music, all of it was just background noise to the fact that Damien Lancaster, the man who prided himself on control, had just completely unraveled because she had almost been taken from him. Eleanor could feel his heart pounding against her own, could feel the way his fingers dug into her waist, like he was trying to convince himself she was real. And then, as quickly as it had happened, he pulled away. Not all the way, but enough for the mask to start slipping back into place. But it wasn't fast enough, because Eleanor had seen the truth, felt it. This wasn't just an arranged marriage anymore. This wasn't just about power, about business, about contracts. Damien Lancaster was terrified of losing her, and that was something he couldn't hide from her anymore. Eleanor had spent weeks trying to crack Damien Lancaster's walls, but it took one near-death experience for them to finally shatter, even if just for a moment. Since the rooftop incident, he had changed. He wasn't avoiding her anymore, wasn't dismissing her like she was just another clause in their marriage contract. No. Now he was watching her. He was present in ways he never had been before. His hand would linger on the small of her back at events. His eyes would track her across the room, and when she caught him staring, he wouldn't even bother looking away. He wasn't indifferent anymore. He was aware. And so was she. This was dangerous, because if she let herself believe that he cared, if she let herself fall into the illusion that he wanted her, she'd be just another fool caught in his cold, calculated world. But then the world stopped, because Eleanor discovered the truth. It started when she walked into his office unannounced, something she had grown comfortable doing despite his protests. He had been on a call, standing near the window, the skyline casting his sharp features in cold, silver light. His voice was low, controlled, like it always was when he was discussing business. But this time, something in his words sent an icy chill through her spine. Yes, the deal was signed months ago. She was always meant to be part of the arrangement. Eleanor's heart stopped. For a second, she thought maybe she had misheard him. Maybe he was talking about something else, anything else. But then came the words that shattered everything. It doesn't matter how she feels. Eleanor was never supposed to know. The room spun. The floor felt unsteady beneath her feet. Damien's back was still to her, unaware that his wife was standing in the doorway, listening as he confirmed her worst nightmare. This wasn't just a business deal. She wasn't just collateral. There was something else, something bigger, something calculated, something planned from the very beginning. A conspiracy that she was never supposed to uncover. Eleanor's breath hitched, and that was when Damien finally turned. The second he saw her, the way her face had gone pale, the way her hands trembled at her sides, he knew. His expression hardened, but there was something behind the steel in his gray eyes, something close to regret. But regret wasn't enough. Not after this. "What?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "Have you done?" Damien didn't answer. And that silence, that cold, suffocating silence, was worse than anything he could have said. Because Eleanor finally knew the truth. She wasn't just sold to him. She was played. And Damien Lancaster was the man who orchestrated it all. Eleanor had thought she had endured the worst of it. The arranged marriage, the cold indifference, the constant push and pull between her and Damien Lancaster, the man who had become both her captor and her obsession. But nothing compared to this. The weight of his betrayal settled over her like an iron cage, suffocating and inescapable. She had been naive to think she was ever in control, to think she had any power in their twisted game. The truth had been there all along, lurking beneath his unreadable expressions, hiding in the way he always seemed one step ahead of her. She had been a pawn, a perfectly placed piece in a chessboard she never even realized she was playing on. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to rip through the cold mask he wore and make him feel even an ounce of the devastation consuming her. But Damien was already watching her, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes scanning her face like he was preparing for the inevitable fallout. "Eleanor," he finally said, his voice calm, controlled. Too controlled. She took a step back, her pulse hammering in her ears. She couldn't breathe. "Don't!" she snapped, her voice shaking, though she willed it not to. "Don't you dare say my name like it means anything to you." Something flickered in his expression, a crack in his impenetrable exterior, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He didn't deny it, didn't tell her she was wrong, because she wasn't. "I wanted to tell you," he admitted, his voice softer now, but so much worse. "But you never would have stayed if you knew the truth." A laugh, sharp, bitter, full of disbelief, escaped her lips. "So you thought lying to me was better? Manipulating me, trapping me in this—" She gestured around the grand, suffocating office, the gilded cage that had become her prison. "Do you even feel anything? Or is this just another game to you?" Something in him snapped. "You think this was easy for me?" His voice was no longer controlled, no longer detached. There was something raw underneath, something dangerously close to emotion. He took a step forward, and she took another step back, refusing to let him pull her into his orbit again. "You were never just part of a deal, Eleanor." The words were so quiet, almost pained, that for a moment she almost believed him, but the damage was already done. "I don't care," she whispered, and the lie nearly choked her. "I don't care what you feel, Damien. Because whatever this was, whatever I thought we had, it was built on a lie." She turned on her heel, her heart pounding so hard it hurt, willing herself to walk away. But before she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "If you leave now, Eleanor, you might never hear the whole truth." She hesitated. And Damien Lancaster, the man who had spent his life controlling every outcome, knew that was his only chance to keep her from walking away forever. Eleanor wanted to walk away, wanted to slam the door behind her and never look back, to disappear from Damien Lancaster's cold, manipulative grasp and erase every trace of the feelings she had been foolish enough to develop for him. But his words stopped her, freezing her in place like an invisible chain wrapped around her heart, pulling her back into his orbit just when she had convinced herself she was free. "If you leave now, Eleanor, you might never hear the whole truth." The cruelty of it was that she still wanted to believe there was something left to salvage, some explanation that would make sense of the chaos he had forced upon her. So instead of walking away, she turned, slowly, arms crossed over her chest as she tried to steel herself against whatever new betrayal he was about to throw her way. "Then start talking," she said, her voice cold, even as her pulse betrayed her with its wild, erratic rhythm. Damien exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair, the first real sign of frustration she had seen from him in weeks. He wasn't as composed as he wanted her to think. Good. Let him feel just an ounce of what she was feeling. "It started with a contract," he admitted, his voice devoid of its usual coldness, but not quite warm either. "Your mother approached me months before our wedding, desperate to save your father's company. She knew I wouldn't invest without leverage." Eleanor's stomach twisted at the confirmation that Vivian had sold her off so easily, as if she were nothing more than a transaction. But that part she already knew. "And you agreed to it," she spat, "because it benefited you, because you needed something in return." Damien's eyes darkened, his jaw clenching at the accusation, but he didn't deny it. "I needed an heir," he said, and the words sent an icy chill through her veins. "Not now, not immediately, but eventually. And your mother knew that. She promised me you would be compliant." Compliant? The word tasted like acid. Eleanor swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "So what? You planned to keep me trapped here until I gave you a child? Was that your endgame?" He didn't flinch, didn't look away, but there was something in his gaze that wasn't as sure, as calculating as it once was. "That was before," he said, and there was weight in those words, something she couldn't quite place. Before? Before what? Before he decided she was an inconvenience? Before he realized she wasn't as easy to control as he had hoped? Before he started... No. She refused to entertain that thought. "And now?" she challenged, her voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. Damien let out a slow breath, stepping closer, and this time she didn't move away. "And now," he murmured, "I don't care about the contract. I don't care about the deal your mother made. I don't even care about what I stood to gain from this marriage." His gray eyes locked onto hers, steady, unrelenting, raw in a way she had never seen before. "I only care about you." Eleanor's breath caught. It was too much and not enough. Because she wanted to believe him. But how could she? How could she trust a man who had built their entire relationship on secrets, manipulation, and control? How could she look at him, and not wonder if every touch, every stolen glance, every whispered moment was just another carefully constructed lie. "You don't get to say that," she whispered, shaking her head, trying to ignore the way her heart clenched at the weight of his confession. "Not after everything, not after—" But before she could finish, before she could convince herself to walk away, Damien closed the distance between them, his fingers tilting her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Then let me prove it," he said, the words barely above a breath, but heavy enough to steal the air from her lungs. And before she could think, before she could stop herself, he kissed her. It wasn't like the first time. That had been a battle, a collision of defiance and frustration, a war neither of them had been willing to lose. But this was different. It was slow, deliberate, filled with something dangerous, something real. His lips were warm against hers, his hand cradling her face with a tenderness that contradicted everything he was supposed to be. And for a moment, she let herself sink into it. Let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was something more than a game. But then reality crashed back in, and she pulled away, breathless, heart pounding, terrified. Damien's expression had shifted, something unreadable flickering in his stormy gray eyes as he studied her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And that was what scared her the most. Because if this was real, if he truly cared, then that meant he could break her in ways no one else ever could. "I don't trust you," she whispered, her voice unsteady, but her resolve firm. Damien didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "Then I'll give you a reason to." Eleanor wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of the war between them. It was only the beginning. Eleanor had thought she was done with her family. She had ignored their calls, blocked their numbers, refused to be their puppet any longer. But of course, Vivian Lancaster didn't give up so easily. So when she received a formal dinner invitation, written in her mother's perfectly elegant handwriting, with a note that simply read, "Come. We have things to discuss," she knew this wasn't a request. It was a demand. And against every ounce of her better judgment, she went. But not alone. This time, Damien Lancaster was coming with her. The dinner was held at her parents' estate, a lavish, tasteless display of wealth that always felt like a hollow attempt to prove their worth to the world. Eleanor walked in, her posture rigid, her chin high, flanked by Damien, silent, unreadable, powerful in a way that made the entire room tense the moment they stepped inside. Cassandra was there, perched at the table like a smug little queen, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the crystal glass in her hand. Her father sat at the head of the table, looking tired, weak, a shadow of the man who had once commanded respect in the business world. But it was her mother who spoke first, her voice carrying the same sharpness it always had when she was about to deliver a blow. "You've been avoiding us," Vivian said smoothly, taking a sip of wine as if this were a casual family gathering and not a battle waiting to explode. Eleanor didn't sit. Neither did Damien. He stayed close, his presence a warning. "You've given me every reason to." Vivian sighed, setting her glass down with a delicate clink. "Eleanor, darling, we're family. You don't just get to walk away." Eleanor let out a cold laugh, crossing her arms. "That's interesting, considering you sold me like a stock investment." Cassandra rolled her eyes dramatically, tossing her blonde curls over her shoulder. "Oh, come on, Eleanor. You got the better end of the deal. A billionaire husband and a life most women would kill for. Don't act like a martyr." And that was it. That was the moment Eleanor snapped. She stepped forward, slamming her hands on the table so hard the silverware rattled, and for the first time, her mother's expression flickered with something close to shock. "You're right, Cassandra. I do have a billionaire husband. But do you know what I don't have? A family. Because a real family doesn't manipulate their daughter into a marriage for their own gain. A real family doesn't lie, cheat, and expect blind loyalty while giving nothing in return." Her father shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't speak, didn't defend her because he never did, and Vivian simply stared, cold and unbothered. "Oh, Eleanor," she murmured, shaking her head. "You've always been so dramatic." Eleanor felt rage rise in her chest like a wildfire, but before she could speak, Damien did. "I wouldn't call it dramatic," he said, his voice calm, measured, but laced with something deadly. The entire room turned to him, startled, because Damien Lancaster had been silent up until now, watching, waiting. He stepped forward, standing next to Eleanor, between her and the people who had used her like a pawn. "I'd call it justified." His gray eyes locked onto Vivian's, and for the first time Eleanor saw her mother falter. "Your mistake was assuming she needed you, that she would always listen, always bend to your will, but she doesn't need you anymore." Vivian's lips curled into something bitter, something defensive. "Oh, please. Do you think you've saved her, Damien? You're no hero. This marriage was your business arrangement too." Damien didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "Yes, and I regret every part of it, except for her." His hand brushed against Eleanor's, just barely, but enough for her to feel the silent message in the touch. "Eleanor isn't just my wife, she's my equal, and I will never let you or anyone else treat her as anything less than that." Silence crashed over the room. Vivian looked like she wanted to lash out. Cassandra's smug expression had vanished entirely, and Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack wide open. Because for the first time in her life, someone had fought for her. Not because they had to, not because it was expected, but because they wanted to. Damien turned to her then, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "Are we done here?" he asked, and for once Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, voice steady, strong. "We're done." And as they walked out together, Eleanor knew this wasn't just the end of a dinner. It was the end of her past, and the beginning of something she never thought she'd have. Eleanor had spent most of her life fighting alone, fighting for approval, for love, for scraps of acknowledgement from people who only saw her as a means to an end. But as she walked out of that house with Damien Lancaster by her side, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she wasn't leaving broken. She was leaving free. And Damien, her cold, unreadable, impossible husband, had stood beside her, not because of obligation, not because of their contract, but because he had chosen to. That realization sat heavy in her chest as they climbed into the car, the silence between them thick with something unspoken, something fragile and powerful all at once. The drive back to the Lancaster estate was quiet. Damien's hands gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tense, his eyes focused straight ahead, but Eleanor could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He wasn't a man who second-guessed himself. He made decisions without hesitation, without regret. But tonight he had made a choice that couldn't be undone. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, her voice softer than she meant it to be. Damien exhaled slowly, a breath heavy with meaning. "Yes, I did." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Because for once they both understood each other without words. But understanding wasn't enough. Not when there was still so much between them that had never been said. And Eleanor wasn't going to walk away from this night without knowing the truth. "Was it all a lie?" she asked, her fingers tightening in her lap as she forced herself to face the question that had haunted her since she overheard his conversation. "Did you ever intend to tell me the truth? Or was I always just another deal you made?" Damien's grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly, his knuckles going white. "It started as a deal," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But it didn't stay that way." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, but she refused to let herself believe in his words too easily. "And when exactly did it change?" she pressed, needing to hear him say it, needing to know if they had ever been real. Damien pulled the car into the long, private driveway of their estate, but instead of stepping out, he turned to her, his expression raw, unguarded in a way she had never seen before. "The night you walked into that business dinner uninvited," he said, his gray eyes locked onto hers. "When you sat next to me and made yourself impossible to ignore, when you looked me in the eye and refused to let me treat you like you were disposable." He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his dark hair. "I told myself it was irritation, that you were just making things difficult. But it wasn't that, it was you. You changed everything." Eleanor's breath caught, her chest tightening with something terrifyingly close to hope. "And yet you still lied," she whispered, because no matter how much she wanted to believe him, the betrayal still clung to her like an open wound. Damien closed his eyes for a brief second, a flicker of regret crossing his features. "I was afraid," he admitted, and the sheer honesty in his voice made her entire body go still. "Afraid that if I told you the truth, you'd walk away. And I couldn't let that happen." Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears, because this was the Damien Lancaster no one else ever got to see. Not the ruthless businessman, not the cold and calculating tycoon. This was the man who had saved her from falling, the man who had stood beside her when she had no one else, and maybe, just maybe, this was the man who had fallen for her, even when he wasn't supposed to. The weight of the moment pressed between them, heavy, fragile, waiting to break. But before Eleanor could say another word, before she could even decide what to do with the truth he had just given her, a loud crash shattered the silence. The glass windows of the estate exploded inward, the sound of gunfire tearing through the night. And in the next heartbeat, Damien was pulling her down, shielding her with his body as chaos erupted around them. Eleanor barely had time to process the gunfire, the shattering glass, the deafening chaos that had turned the Lancaster estate into a war zone. One moment, she was on the verge of confronting everything Damien had just admitted, and the next, she was being tackled to the floor, his body shielding hers as gunshots ripped through the walls. The scent of smoke and shattered wood filled the air, the sharp sting of adrenaline surging through her veins, as Damien's voice was in her ear, low and urgent. "Stay down, don't move." His body was tense above hers, protective, unyielding, his every muscle locked in anticipation of another attack. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. A deadly, suffocating silence. Damien moved first, his grip on her waist unrelenting as he pulled her to her feet, his eyes scanning the room like a man who had been trained for moments like this. Security guards rushed in, their weapons drawn, their shouts blending into the ringing in Eleanor's ears. But none of that mattered. What mattered was who was behind this. And when the first masked man was tackled to the ground, his ski mask ripped away, Eleanor's blood turned to ice. It was one of her father's men. Damien's entire body went still beside her, deadly still. Two more attackers were taken down, their faces ones she knew too well. Her mother's security detail. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together so fast it made Eleanor's head spin. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't a business rival targeting Damien. This was her family. Vivian, Cassandra. They had done this. Eleanor's stomach twisted as the realization settled like a stone in her gut. Her own family had sent armed men to sabotage her marriage, to punish her for walking away, for choosing Damien over them. Damien's voice cut through the haze, sharp and lethal. "Get me her mother, now." The next thing she knew, they were in the Lancaster boardroom, the air thick with fury, betrayal, and something far more dangerous. Damien's silence. Vivian and Cassandra sat across from them, composed, calculating, but their masks were cracking. Eleanor could see the flickers of desperation beneath their perfectly curated facades. "You tried to have me killed," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the hurricane inside her. "Your own daughter." Vivian didn't flinch. She simply sighed, taking a sip of her wine, as if she wasn't sitting in a room where her crimes were being laid bare. "Oh, Eleanor, don't be so dramatic. We only meant to scare you. Shake things up a little." Damien moved before Eleanor even saw him react. 1 second he was sitting beside her, and the next he was towering over Vivian, hands pressed against the table, his voice low and deadly. "You hired men to open fire on my home," he said, each word deliberate, calm in a way that sent chills down Eleanor's spine. "That's not shaking things up. That's war." Cassandra, for once, looked shaken. "You don't understand," she snapped, her usual arrogance faltering. "You stole her from us. You made her forget where she came from, made her think she was better than us." Eleanor laughed, a hollow, sharp sound that made both her mother and sister stiffen. "You don't get to twist this. You sold me, Cassandra. You both did. And when I refused to be your puppet, you tried to destroy me." Vivian's lips pursed. "We did what was best for the family." And that was when Eleanor realized something crystal clear. There was no family, not anymore, not ever. Damien straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with an eerie sort of calm. "Well, let me make something clear to you, Mrs. Lancaster," he said, his gray eyes glinting like steel. "Your family just lost everything." And just like that, he destroyed them. Damien had been prepared for this moment. He had been watching, waiting, anticipating the moment they would make their move. And now, he pressed the final nail into their coffin. The Lancaster family empire crumbled in one night. Every financial lifeline Vivian and Cassandra had relied on, gone. Every shady deal, every backdoor investment, every under-the-table bribe, exposed. And when it was over, when their mother sat there, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line, when Cassandra looked seconds away from screaming, Eleanor leaned in, her voice soft, final. "Now we're even." Then she turned to Damien, and for the first time, he didn't need to ask if she was ready to leave. They walked out together, side by side, as equals. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor knew she was finally free. Eleanor had spent her entire life fighting for scraps of love, of approval, of freedom. First, from her mother, who saw her as nothing more than a bargaining chip. Then from her sister, who wanted to see her fail, suffer, disappear. And finally, from Damien Lancaster, the man she had once believed was just another prison, another captor, another person who would use her and toss her aside. But as they walked out of that boardroom together, leaving behind the wreckage of her family's empire, she realized something earth-shattering. Damien had never been her cage. He had been her way out. The fallout was swift and brutal. Vivian and Cassandra were finished, stripped of their power, their money, their influence. The women who had spent their lives controlling others were now the ones begging for mercy. But Eleanor didn't look back. She didn't offer forgiveness, didn't extend a hand to pull them out of the ruin they had created. Because they hadn't just hurt her, they had tried to destroy her. And Damien had stopped them, not just because it benefited him, not because it was part of some calculated business move, but because it was her. That night, as they returned to the Lancaster estate, as they walked through the same doors that had once felt suffocating, but now felt like a home she never knew she needed, Eleanor felt the weight of everything settle onto her chest. The truth, the fear, the war they had fought and won together. And Damien saw it. He had spent his life mastering the art of control, of shutting people out, of never needing anyone. But tonight, as he watched Eleanor sink onto the leather couch in the living room, staring blankly ahead, lost in the weight of everything, he didn't hesitate. He sat beside her, one arm draped over the back of the couch, the other reaching for her hand. Not forceful, not possessive. Just there. For the first time, he didn't try to command the room. He let her lead. "You're free now," he said after a long silence, his voice lower, rougher than usual. Eleanor let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Am I?" She turned to him, her hazel eyes searching his, because this wasn't just about her mother and sister. This was about them, about what they were, about whether they were built on anything real or if it had all been another war neither of them wanted to lose. Damien didn't look away. Yes, his fingers brushed against hers, slow, deliberate. "And I know you don't owe me anything. You don't have to stay." Eleanor felt her chest tighten, because for the first time since she had been forced into this marriage, she realized he meant it. If she walked away tonight, he wouldn't stop her. He would let her go. But she didn't want to. Because despite everything, the deception, the war, the heartbreak, Damien had fought for her. And not just against her family, against himself. Against everything that had kept him from feeling, from needing, from caring. And now, he was looking at her like she was the only thing that had ever mattered. Eleanor exhaled, slow and steady, then turned her body toward him completely. She reached up, cupped the side of his face, her fingers tracing the sharp lines of his jaw. He tensed, just for a second, as if he wasn't used to being touched so gently. Then he leaned into it, and Eleanor made her choice. She kissed him. It wasn't like before, not desperate, not full of anger and fire and the need to prove something. This was different. This was real. Soft and slow and full of everything neither of them had been able to say. Damien's arm slid around her waist, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss, like he had been waiting for this, like this was the moment he had been afraid to hope for. And when they finally pulled apart, foreheads resting together, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I love you, Eleanor." The words settled like a promise, like a vow, and for the first time, she believed them. Because Damien Lancaster was many things, cold, calculated, ruthless. But when it came to her, he had never been a liar. And as Eleanor smiled, her first real, unguarded smile in years, she knew she had won. Not just the war, but the life she had always deserved. Eleanor had spent her entire life believing love was conditional, that it had to be earned, bargained for, given in exchange for something else. Her mother had taught her that, Cassandra had reinforced it, and Damien had challenged everything. Days passed, and then weeks, and something changed between them. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in the quiet moments. The way he reached for her hand without thinking, the way he let her sleep in his bed, not because he wanted to claim her, but because he simply wanted her there. The way he watched her when she wasn't looking, like he was still trying to convince himself she was real. And Eleanor? She let him in. Slowly, carefully, fully. Their marriage had started as a battlefield, but now it was a choice. The first time he asked her, she laughed. "Marry me." They were in his office late at night, both of them working on separate projects but unable to stay apart. She had been curled up on the couch, her laptop balancing on her knees, sipping tea while Damien stood near his desk, watching her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. Eleanor smirked over her cup. "Hate to break it to you, but I already did." Damien's lips quirked at the corner, but his eyes were serious. "No," he said quietly, crossing the room, stopping just before her. "That wasn't real. This is." Her heart skipped a beat. "Marry me," he repeated, and this time her breath caught in her throat. Because it wasn't a demand. It was a request. A choice. Eleanor swallowed hard, setting her tea aside, watching the man in front of her. The man she had once hated. The man she had once feared. The man she now loved more than anything in this world. And for the first time, it wasn't a difficult decision at all. Yes. The wedding was small, intimate, private. Not because it had to be, but because that was how they wanted it. No cameras, no business deals disguised as celebrations, no Vivian, no Cassandra, just them, and the life they had built together. Eleanor stood at the altar, her dress soft, flowing, nothing like the rigid, structured gown she had worn the first time. This time there was no fear, no hesitation, no contract forcing her forward. And when Damien took her hands, pressed a slow kiss against her knuckles and whispered, "This time, it's forever," she knew. She had won. Not just her freedom, not just her revenge, but the love she had always deserved. And as they walked down the aisle together, side by side, as equals, as partners, as two people who had fought their way through war and chaos and fire to find each other, Eleanor knew this was only the beginning.